I guess you could say that's our organic way of welcoming everybody to today's service. Good morning, welcome, and a happy hello. Another Sunday here at First Unitarian Society, where independent thinkers gather in a safe, nurturing environment to explore issues of social, spiritual, and ethical significance as we try to make a difference in this world. I'm Steve Goldberg, a proud, unimpeachable member of this congregation. And I'd like to extend a very special welcome to any guests, visitors, or newcomers. If this is your first time at First Unitarian Society, I think you'll find that it's a special place. And if you'd like to learn more about our special buildings, we'll be conducting a guided tour, or maybe we're guiding a conducted tour, I'm not sure which, right after the service. If you're interested, just gather over by the windows immediately following the service, and we'll take good care of you. Speaking of taking care of each other, this is a perfect time to silence those pesky electronic devices that you just won't need for the next hour, because instead of worrying about your messages and your calls, you'll be sitting back or leaning forward to enjoy today's service, which I know will touch your heart, stir your spirit, and trigger one or two new thoughts. We're glad you're here, and now we invite you to join in a moment of centering silence so we can be fully present with each other this morning.
Come, let us enter this space of hope and community. Come, let us enter this space with our sorrows, our joys, our passion and compassion. Come, let us enter this space with the stories of our ancestors, for their strength and wisdom beats in our hearts. Come into this space, present to the beloved companions who move beside us. Come into this space, mindful that together we are building a future for other generations. Come into this space and let us worship. We'll begin our worship this morning by singing together hymn number 126, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing. I invite you to stand in all the ways that we do.
Come thou fount of every blessing, tune our hearts to sing thy praise. Streams of mercy never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise. While the hope of life's perfection fills our hearts with joy and love, teach us ever to be faithful. May we still thy goodness prove. Come thou fount of every vision, lift our eyes to what may come. See the lion and the young lamb dwell together in thy home. Hear the cries of war fall silent, feel our love glow like the sun.
remain up as we light our common flame this morning to the words printed in your order of service. As together we say, let us remember that we are doing the work of the congregation. When we do the work of this congregation, we touch lives. When we touch lives, we change the world. May this chalice flame we now kindle remind us of our ministry and our mission. I invite you to turn to one another, introduce yourselves, and offer a friendly greeting.
Good to see you. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning.
You're going to come forward for a story. The young and young at heart are welcome to come forward for a story.
Hello, everyone.
All right, have a seat.
Yeah, it's confusing. Both of us are. We'll get in closer together.
Good morning, everybody.
Good
Come
morning,
on
everyone.
down.
Come on up. We have a lot that we're doing this morning. It's really exciting. We have a wonder box to look in a few minutes, but first, I believe that we have a wonderful story that Reverend Karen will share with us. So, I know, I just
Nice, exciting.
looking
Yafa
forward to
and
it.
Fatima, it's called. Shalom Salam. In a beautiful land called the Land of Milk and Honey, there lived two neighbors. One was named Yafa, and the other was named Fatima. Yafa and Fatima each owned a beautiful date grove. During the week, they both worked very hard gathering their dates. Has anyone eaten a date before?
Yes.
Yeah. What's it taste like? Kind of sugary. Yes. On most days, Yafa and Fatima sold all their dates at the market and were able to buy plenty of tasty food to eat, which they often shared. Yafa loved Fatima's shawarma, and Fatima loved Yafa's schnitzel. Yafa prayed in the synagogue. Fatima prayed in the mosque. They both loved God, and they both loved to follow God's way. Yafa would read from her Siddur in the morning, and Fatima would read from her Quran in the morning. Two different sacred texts. Yafa fasted on Yom Kippur, and Fatima fasted on Ramadan, during Ramadan.
Ramadan is a very bad fast because you can only
Ramadan is a long month of fasting, isn't it?
Yes,
where
it
you
is.
can only eat.
You can only eat in the night, he's telling us. Yes, indeed. Fatima celebrated Eid, and Yafa celebrated Passover. When Yafa saw Fatima, she would wave and call, "Shalom, peace." Shalom. Can you say shalom?
Shalom.
That's the word for peace. And when Fatima saw Yafa, she would wave and call, "Salam, peace." Can you say salam?
Salam.
It sounds a little bit like salami, but it's salam.
Yes. Very different.
Well, one year, There was very little rain. Fatima and Yafa had very few dates to eat or to sell at the market. Yafa lay awake at night. She worried. Maybe Fatima is hungry, thought Yafa. Fatima also lay awake at night. She also was worried. Perhaps Yafa didn't have enough to eat today, thought Fatima. So Fatima placed a basket of dates on her donkey. Then she took them to Yafa's house. She poured the dates into a basket on Yafa's porch. Meanwhile, Yafa collected a basket of dates, placed it on her donkey, and carried it to Fatima's house. She poured the dates into a basket on Fatima's porch. The two neighbors quietly made their way back home, feeling very happy. Well, in the morning, when Yafa walked onto her porch, to her great surprise, she saw her basket full of dates. Goodness, I have so many dates, I will take more to Fatima tonight. Meanwhile, Fatima walked out onto her porch and was just as surprised. Goodness, I have more dates than I thought. I will take some more to Yafa tonight. That night, both Yafa and Fatima loaded their donkeys with dates and set off toward each other's homes. They met just where their fields came together. Fatima looked at Yafa, and Yafa looked at Fatima. The two friends hugged each other, and they laughed. Shalom, said Yafa. Salam, said Fatima. Thank you for thinking of me, said Yafa. Thank you for thinking of me too, said Fatima. Together, they returned to Yafa's house to share a meal of dates and tea.
That's such a great story. They were really good friends and good neighbors.
Yeah, they were. It reminds me of these kids being neighbors.
Yeah. I wonder, actually,
No,
that
they're
may
kinda-
have something to do with our Wonder Box.
Yeah, you're neighbors to each other and you're neighbors to me and Reverend Doug.
So let's see what is in here. No, not a rubber duck, alas. But far better than that, bookmarks. We have bookmarks in here that very soon, after this week, will live in our gray hymnals. And these bookmarks, we actually borrowed the idea from some other congregations, are meant to have some suggestions about welcoming neighbors in our congregation. That is, all of you. Various ways that we can be more welcoming of young families and our young people in our midst, because we want you to know that you're a gift to the congregation and that your presence here makes a difference to us. And so we want to make sure that you feel welcome too. So I wonder, Karin, if you could help me read some of what are on these bookmarks so that we know what it is that we're going to think about together.
That sounds great. Okay, the first point says, welcome children and give them a smile of encouragement.
The second point is, exactly, be patient with noises and movement. Good. Yes, exactly.
Teach our children with positive messages, kind and caring words.
Another one is learn the names of our children.
Thank children for being in our community.
Offer to hold a crying baby. Exactly. It would be fun.
Know where the activity materials are and feel free to offer them to children.
And remember that the way that we welcome children in our congregation affects the way that they feel about this community and worship. Let them know that they are at home and welcome here in this place.
These are great suggestions.
They are good suggestions. I'm glad we borrowed them because they work if we do them together.
How about we do the blessing before we send the kids?
No. Well, you do not want
There's
to do
some
that, that's for
questions
sure.
about whether or not to hold someone else's baby because you might drop it.
Yes. You'd
So
be
you-
very careful.
Yeah.
So let's let's bless these bookmarks. Not so much that the bookmarks need a blessing, but it is a way of us saying that we think it's important to take the ideas and try them when we can. It blesses the congregation to do that together. So may these bookmarks be a reminder of what we value in this community and the people of every age, helping them making them feel warm and welcome here. So if you agree with that wish, I invite us to say together, we do.
We do. All right. Well, thank you all for being part of our UU community here. I invite you to go to your RE classes now, and
Everyone.
we will sing hymn number 146, Soon the Day Will Arrive.
Soon the day will arrive when we will be together, and no longer will we live in fear. And the children will smile without wondering whether on this day thunder clouds will appear. Wait and see what a world we can be if we share, if we care, you and me. Wait and see what a world there can be if we share, if we care, you and me. Some have dreams, some have died to make a bright tomorrow, and our vision remains in our hearts. Now the torch must be passed with new hope, not in sorrow, and a promise to make a new start. Wait and see what a world there can be if we share, if we care, you and me. Wait and see what a world there can be if we share, if we care, you and me. You may be seated.
This morning's reading comes from the Reverend Karen Herring. And she writes, "The first time I saw the phrase oriented ×3, I was working in a hospital as a chaplain. The phrase was used frequently in patient charts, and at first I thought it might be shorthand for an extremely oriented patient, like being oriented to the third power or being uber-oriented. I imagined a patient who is aware on many levels, sharp, quick, responsive, cognizant of what was going on inside her and around her.
A nurse then explained to me that the phrase refers to being oriented to person, place, and time, a determination commonly made by asking patients, "What is your name? Do you know where you are? Do you know what day it is?" And I began to wonder if we might ask similar questions to determine if a person is oriented spiritually. What would it mean to be spiritually oriented ×3? What questions might we ask to determine that?
What is your name?
Do you know who you are? Do you know whose you are?
Do you know where you are?
What is your place in the world, in your life, in your relationships?
What day is it today?
What time is it in your life? What is it time for? What are you living for today, tomorrow, yesterday?
These are not unrelated to other questions I ask all the time in hospital rooms, in the pulpit on Sunday, in long nights when I am alone. What do I believe? Where do I belong? What does it all mean?
Certainly, I know the questions better than the answers, but I also know this. We all have spiritual compasses inside of us that help us to arrive at our own answers. Sometimes we can read our compasses more easily than others, but we all have something that spins towards north, an inner tug toward the holy. And in those times when our compass is impossible to find or read, or when it points in a direction we don't want to go, we can turn to one another, or to maps that help us get oriented, or to constellations that guide us to where we are headed.
Perhaps this is what it means to be spiritually oriented times 3. Oriented to self, oriented to others, and oriented to the holy. Perhaps this is what we are doing here together, reading our compasses, finding our way in a universe of shining stars, and making new maps to help one another.
Here ends our reading. So we are in the midst of a month when we are exploring a larger process that actually will take us through this church year together, one that asks us to think about our missional identity. And there are two consultants that not only wrote the book on that process, but have helped hundreds, if not thousands, of congregations all over the world to do that process, including many, many Unitarian Universalist congregations. Gil Rendell and Alice Mann are consultants originally with a group, the Alban Institute, that no longer exists, but they continue to do that work. And they were the people through trial and error that came up with the questions that help orient ourselves. Who are we? Whom do we serve? And what are we called to do in the next years? And so we are thinking about that second question. Whom do we serve? And they remind us that congregations are born from a spark of interaction between a faith tradition and a particular context. That means that the story of this congregation, every congregation, is linked to the political, economic, social, and spiritual dynamics of a particular place and time. Being in this time and being situated in the community of Madison at large makes this congregation unique in how it understands its faith. And as times change, while we hope that some foundational components of the congregation will not, the powerful realities of what is true in a community in a given time and moment should reorient how we understand ourselves. And the answer, whom do we serve, should be always redefined, at least in some way, by the particular time and place that we live when we ask it again and again. As a matter of fact, the two consultants remind congregations that it should be a regular spiritual practice to reorient yourself in your community, as it really is now. We very often lose track of the changes or see them differently in our day-to-day life, but to be more intentional about understanding what the community around you is like now and what this particular time is asking of us, and that ongoing process year after year is a vital discipline within a congregation. And this discipline asks that question on at least two levels. And it starts with the closest context, within the congregation itself. Whom do we serve may be understood to mean who are we seeking to attract to come into our congregation? Who do we want to be part of our community here? Do we bring some intention about it? And the truth is that many, many congregations really choose to serve who happens to walk in the door week after week. But even in that truth, just the ongoing process of discovering who is finding this place meaningful, who is walking in our door, really trying to see where they are coming from and what they need, that practice in and of itself is a full-time job and a deeply meaningful place of discernment in a congregation. And many congregations, as they begin to think about what is happening in their community, decide at different times that they want to put special effort in attracting certain people to the congregation. For instance, they learn that they happen to be situated in a place where there are a fair number of immigrants. And so they think about the idea, is there a way that we can more effectively serve the immigrant population around us and invite them to be part of our community? So that's one level, but there's also a second level that has to do with taking the exploration truly out into the larger community. That the congregation actually, in various ways, walks out into the world with the understanding of trying to see what is true in the community that has impact for their ministry and work in the future. And so one of the things that happens in the interim time is in a variety of ways, we invite the congregation to do some of that work. Right now, members of the transition team have been brainstorming various kinds of organizations, everything from political activism organizations to organizations that do social justice, arts work, educational organizations, and they are going to visit some of those places and inviting members of the congregation to join them and talk with those people about what they see happening in the community now and what they are doing to try to address that and what a future partnership might look like if that were to happen one day between their organization and this congregation. That work really helps us think about what we are called to do now. And it is very enlivening and powerful work. And that particular part of it reminds me of the original version of the question that the two consultants, Alice Mann and Gil Rindle, came up with, that they adapted a little bit because they work in so many different contexts, both faith communities and business communities. The original version of the question that we're exploring now is, who is our neighbor? And understanding the implications of what that question means is very exhilarating and really brings us into a whole new level of exploration.
And as your neighbor, can I jump in now?
Please do, yes.
We're doing a dialogue sermon today in exploration of this neighbor question. And as I've been thinking about who is our neighbor, I've been thinking about the different elements that make a good neighbor. I've been thinking about, well, obviously, being close to each other, being in proximity, having some interaction, but then also being in relationship. So I might be close to someone and maybe just ignore them. But actually being in relationship and relating to one another is another aspect or ingredient. But then also the third, maybe sometimes the hardest ingredient for me at least, is being open to being changed by that relationship and by that proximity. And I think we saw that in the children's book we shared with the children this morning. The two neighbors, Yafa and Fatima, were so different. Unique, wonderful people living their lives to the best of their ability, living right next to each other, so having that proximity, but then also being in relationship. So they would share food together and enjoy each other's company and greet each other with expressions of peace. But then also, thirdly, they had that openness to being changed, that openness to say, oh no, what if she's hungry? How can I help? I want to make a difference in her life. And so that got me thinking about my own neighbors. And of course, I have many that I really appreciate, but there's one in particular that I have a story to share. Her name is Lynn. Lynn and I have lived next to each other for over 20 years. Our kids grew up together. Our dogs played in our backyards with one another. And she is the kind of neighbor who snowplows the end of my driveway in the middle of winter when there are snow rocks there, and my shovel just is not going to cut it. And I'm the kind of neighbor who loves to share my produce from the garden, especially the zucchini. And a little over a year ago now, it was late summer of last year when Madison was experiencing these historic floods. The lakes were very high, and the Yahara River was overflowing its banks. And I lived just about 5 blocks from the Yahara River, and at that time, Lynn was recovering from hip replacement surgery. Well, one day I got a knock on the door, and I was like, oh, I don't want to deal with this. It's too much going on. I don't know. I wasn't expecting anyone. I was the only one home. I was like, I'm just going to ignore it. But then, of course, I went and peeked. And outside in the driveway of Lynn's, outside in Lynn's driveway was a big pickup truck full of sandbags. And unbeknownst to me, my wife had ordered some sandbags from the city And I was like, of course, she wasn't there to take care of it. That's kind of typical. Hey, honey, there's something new for you to do. And so, but there were the volunteers with the sandbags. And so, of course, I went out and got them around the foundation of our house and around the windows. And then I thought, oh my, what about Lynn? She was still walking around with a cane. And so I went over and I checked, and she agreed, yes, she needed some sandbags. So with the 2 volunteers and I, we were able to put those sandbags in her basement and around the foundation of her house. But what really moved me was that she was so grateful. She didn't know exactly how to give thanks because she was feeling so vulnerable at that time, not knowing if we were going to have to evacuate, not knowing how she was going to move just on a regular day, let alone on a flood day. And so to have her neighbor come and offer some help with sandbags moved her, and her being moved me. So it was in that way, because of our proximity to one another, and because of our ongoing relationship, and because of our openness to being changed by one another, that we are continually able to change each other's lives.
It directly relates actually to the original question as Gil and Alice posed it. Who is our neighbor? The actual context of that question is related to the parable of the Good Samaritan, that if we know almost anything about the Bible, we know that story, but we often don't realize the original context that brings the story up. And it's basically that some very scholarly and learned folks in religion are questioning Jesus and sort of trying to trip him up and prove that he is not abiding by sort of the letter of the religious law. And so they ask Jesus, who is our neighbor? And what they hope he will say is something that violates their understanding of what the right answer is, so they can discredit him. And Jesus tells them a story, and the story has a really powerful intention, because we tend to forget out of context that we use the word Good Samaritan to mean someone who does a good thing. But originally, someone who was a Samaritan would have been, to the original audience, someone, because of cultural tensions, would have been regarded as a person less than their own culture, someone that there was enemy feelings and great conflict with. And so when Jesus tells the story and has these learned and very religious people walking by someone in trouble, and it is the very person that his audience would have despised that takes the moment to let the reality that he sees really change his heart and his mind and actually do something. Jesus is clear that it doesn't matter ultimately whether you stand by the letter of the law of your life. It is how you act in accord with the spirit of it that matters most. And so again and again, as we are thinking about the answer to this question, we are thinking about what it really means to be beloved community in the deepest sense, and how it does ask us to be vulnerable to each other and to our deepest self. And in that process, we will sometimes not know what to do. And I find myself thinking about Reverend Herring's quote, "We all have spiritual compasses inside us that help us arrive at our own answers. But sometimes we can read our compasses more easily than others. But we all have something that spins toward north, an inner tug toward the holy." That reminder seems important as we begin to think about who we might serve as a congregation. What is that inner tug calling us to do?
Yes. And as I've been reflecting on Reverend Herring's reading, I've been thinking about the parallels between our individual lives of being spiritually oriented times 3 and our congregational life of being spiritually oriented times 3. So certainly as individuals, to return to the holy or return to what is most meaningful to us, we have to be in right relationship with ourselves, and then in right relationship with each other, and then in right relationship with that sacred moment, the sacredness of what we find in our lives to be most important. This is ongoing work. It's not always taking us where we expect it to take us. As I speak in seminary, I'm very aware of that. But when it comes to this congregation, I'm also seeing those 3 questions. So a couple of weeks ago, we got oriented to person. Reverend Kelly asked us, who do we choose to be? Do we know who we are? Do we know whose we are? And of course, these are key questions for Unitarian Universalists and for the entire community of First Unitarian Society of Madison. Then this week, we're talking about our orientation to place, to being a neighbor in the world, to being in proximity and having relationships and being open to being changed. So do we know where we are? What does it mean to be a neighbor of Ronald McDonald House, or the Veterans Hospital, or the community at the university? Who are we serving today in this place by being here together? And then next week, this is a little preview, we'll be becoming oriented to time. What is it time to do in the life of this congregation? What are we living for? Given who we know ourselves to be and who our relationships are in our location, what are we being called forth to do? So I have to say, even though I've only been here a short time, I have seen First Unitarian Society already respond to a call. And this was last October when in Pittsburgh there was that mass shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue. 11 people were left dead, and many in our community were feeling such grief and shock and fear. And there was one thing that, as I understand it, the Jewish community of Madison knew, that they wanted to gather together, but also that it didn't feel safe to gather in their own synagogues. So Rabbi Laurie contacted the ministers of First Unitarian Society to check on the use of this space. So Rabbi Laurie is the rabbi of Congregation Shirir Shemaim, the community that has for over a decade now been worshiping in this building. And so the very next day after that mass shooting, this very room was just packed. It was overflowing with people out into the commons area and on the stairwell and up above and in the hallways. And that interfaith solidarity moment wouldn't have happened, or may not have happened, but certainly because of our relationship with Rabbi Laurie and Congregation Shirir Shemaim, there was that proximity already. And we've been having a decade-long relationship with their congregation. And then the question of being open to change. If you were able to attend, as I was, you may have felt a different connection to the fear and the horror of the violence in our world these days. And also, you may have felt a new connection to hope by being among an interfaith gathering. And it makes me wonder, as a congregational neighbor, how often do we allow ourselves to be changed and to be vulnerable to the hardships in our world? And will we continue to allow our congregational relationships to change us? So back to that story of the Good Samaritan, it reminds me just that if we embody, if we act, if we take that opportunity to be a good neighbor, then we open ourselves up to being changed and to transformation. So my hope and wish for all of us today is that we remain open to this transformation by being present in each other's lives, both today and in the days to come.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
As we move into our time of our offering, may we be aware of how it calls us week after week to understand our connection with the world. And in particular, every week as we share our offering, may we remember that our outreach offering will be shared this week with Wisconsin Council for the Blind and Visually Impaired. You may find more information about their work in the red floors. May that spirit of deep connection and generosity guide us as the offering is now given and received.
Thank you for your generosity for the offering. I should mention that next week's offering will involve canned goods and non-perishable food items as we take another step in taking care of our neighbors. So just advance notice, you'll get more information about that later. I think it's also in the Red Floors Bulletin. But make a note, next weekend, canned foods, FUS, 9 o'clock. Speaking of neighbors taking care of each other, we have some neighbors to thank for their generous service and volunteering in support of these services. So, thank you to Ann Smiley for serving as our lay minister. Thanks to our ushers, Marty Hollis, Paul Abramson, Cynthia Nolan, and Dan Bradley. And thanks to our hospitality and coffee hosts, Eleni Musarad Varga and Franz Musarad Varga in the kitchen. Make sure you thank them. That's a good way to get a nice hot cup of coffee. Staffing the information table is our friend Mary Bergen, and our tour guide is John Powell. Just a couple announcements for you. Next weekend is our big art fair, Art in the Right Place. Proud and happy to mention that we have 70 of you, 70 volunteers, who have already signed up, and that's all we need. So, way to take care of our neighbors for Art in the Right Place. Also, you may have seen somebody out in the parking lot collecting Thanksgiving food. So if you brought something with you, or if you want to come back a little bit later, that option is still open for the rest of the morning. And speaking of neighbors taking care of each other, which is a form of stewardship, and you all know how passionate I am about stewardship in this particular congregation. Many of you have received this insert in the mail. There's also this insert in your Red Floors Bulletin about closing the gap in our stewardship effort. We're pretty close to having all the money we need to fulfill our budget commitments for the next year. We just need a little bit more help, and thanks to you, we've already closed that gap. The gap was $120,000. Now it's about $103,000, so thanks for taking care of your neighbor. If you haven't had a chance to pledge yet this fiscal year, you have the opportunity in this little piece of paper, this insert. And if you have pledged and would like to help us get closer to closing the gap, that opportunity is available to you as well. So speaking of neighbors, we have a special parish meeting on Sunday, December 8, right after the 11 o'clock service. Special parish meeting right here, Sunday, December 8, to continue the conversation about stewardship. Hope to see you there.
We join together each week as a community who gathers with joys and sorrows written on our hearts. In this place we love and are loved. We give and we receive in return. We come together to find strength and common purpose, turning our minds and hearts towards one another, seeking to bring into our circle of concern all who need our love and support. This week, we remember those in Southern California, in Iraq, in Hong Kong, and in many places around the world. We also remember ourselves, who may be struggling or celebrating, and all that is happening in the lives of our loved ones, near and far. May we remember that we are part of a web of life that makes us one with all humanity, one with all the universe. And may we be grateful for the miracle of life that we share and the hope that gives us the power to care, to remember, and to love. As we remember and love, we also sing. I invite you to sing our closing hymn, number 1017, Building a New Way. Please rise in all the ways that we do. I'm going to have to share with you.
We are building a new way. We are building a new way. We are building a new way, feeling stronger every day. We are building a new. We are working to be free. 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 Hate and greed and jealousy. We are working to be free. Peace and freedom. Peace and freedom is our cry. Peace and freedom is our cry. Peace and freedom is our cry. Without these, this world will die. Peace and freedom is our cry. And now, as we prepare to leave this space made sacred by our presence together, may we know that deep in our bones we are building a new way in this world. We build it every time we seek and strive to be spiritually oriented, serving not just ourselves, but also our neighbor.
We extinguish this flame, but not our love for this community, our passion for justice, or our commitment to serve. These we will share throughout our lives until we gather together again. Now I invite you to be seated for the last gift of music.